Okay, we'll just give it a couple more minutes and just see if we've got anybody else joining us.
Okay.
And then if not, we'll make a start. I was just getting the technology stuff sorted. So it's that kind of awkward beginning, waiting for it to start.
I'm just reading, don't mind me.
Is it strange talking about a book that you translated so long ago? Is it?
Yeah, it's also, you always find things you want to change when you read your translations. But that's territory. It always takes me back to the room I was in when I was translating it. I translated this in New York.
I guess it's such a close reading that when you read a book that really kind of sticks with you anyway, I mean, not translated, but just a book that really sticks with you, then it takes you back. But because it's such a close reading, then it must be more so, I guess, because it would occupy your headspace so much.
Yeah, I find translating is so much more intense than reading. Sometimes, my husband is also a translator. Sometimes he'll be translating a book that I've read. He translates from English, and he'll ask me a question, and I'll look and I was like, I don't know, because you don't have to know all the answers, what every word means when you're reading. You're just reading, but when you're translating, you have to
overthink it. Yeah. Think it, then think it, then think it again, and then go back to the first thing it says. Okay, obviously, right. Okay. Right, shall we make a start? Oh, somebody else has just come in as well. So there's 10 of us, which is that's a nice size group. Thank you everyone for joining us. The same as we did last time is if you want to turn your cameras on and have your cameras on, then you're very welcome to. If you'd rather stay anonymous, then that's all okay. Maybe then if we when we come to the small group session again, like we did last time, we could turn the cameras on, and that'd be nice so that we can, it can look like a little bit more of a discussion. First of all, I'm going to say thank you to our guests for joining us today. We are very lucky to have Mara Faye-Leatham with us here. She's a very experienced translator, and I'm hoping that you're all going to really benefit from the benefit of her experience and her knowledge about the translation industry, the translation profession, and translation as a creative practice as well. Mara is a translator from both Spanish and Catalan. She's translated some of the most well-known contemporary Catalan authors, including Jaume Cabré, Albert Sánchez Piñol, Toni Sala, Marc Pastor. She's an award-winning translator. She's reviewed books for the New York Times, and she's done lots of work as a mentor for the ALTA Translation Association in the US. I'm not going to say much more about your life work, because hopefully you're going to tell us all about that yourself now, as I pull it out of you with some questions. The structure of the session today for everyone, what I hope to do is we're going to have maybe a 20-minute, 25-minute chat with Mara about her her experience, how she got into translation, what her job is, what she does, everything and anything, and then we're going to talk to her about two of her books that that I've told you already. So one of them is Brother in Ice, and the other one is Learning to Talk to Plants, which is one of her most recent translations that was published this year. If you have any questions as we go along, then you're more than welcome to put them in the chat, and I'll kind of ask her them as we go along. If not, we can do some questions and answers at the end, so whichever you prefer. But if you've kind of a burning question comes up as we go along, then please feel free to put it in the chat. The talk is being recorded, and we're also live streaming for the first time, which is very exciting, on Facebook. So if there's anything that you miss and you want to go back to, then there's lots of ways that you can find us as well at the end. So let's get started. So Mara, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your education and how you came to the world of literary translation?
Sure. I had sort of a roundabout path, and at a certain point, I realized that a lot of us who translate from Catalan, because the Institut Ramon Llull organized an event for translators that live in Barcelona. This was years ago. And I went, and I was actually talking to the Italian translator of the book that I was translating at the time. I was like, what page are you on? It was a very long book. And I realized that most of us there had, that were living in Barcelona particularly, were married to Catalans. So that is it's changing now, especially in the UK, because you can study Catalan in more universities. In the US, there's only 2 universities where you can study Catalan and get a minor. But so it's been a pretty neglected language academically. And I certainly was able to get a degree in Spanish language and literature without really being exposed to Catalan. And when I was in college, I studied English literature and Spanish literature, and Latin American, of course. And I studied abroad in Madrid, which was where I first heard about Catalan, and people were like, be careful. If you go to Barcelona and you're bleeding on the street, they won't give you a Band-Aid if you don't know how to say it in Catalan. So my curiosity grew once I moved to Barcelona and realized that there was kind of this whole other world hiding in plain sight. I remember seeing a store whose name was like, I forget the last name, the surname was something, and I Nebot, which means and nephew, like Maragall I Nebot. And I had assumed that Nebot was another surname, and till I started to study Catalan, and I realized that meant nephew. But so that there were these layers to Barcelona that I became curious about, and also became curious about the very overt linguistic politics here, where there were exhortations to teach Catalan to those around you, to not switch to Spanish, which is a hangover from the dictatorship, the most recent dictatorship, where you couldn't use Catalan in the public sphere, so it became kind of an ingrown, again, this hiding in plain sight language that was used still in the home and in a lot of cases, but it couldn't be used in the public sphere. So, and also, well, when I first started to speak Catalan, and my Catalan was very bad, people would change to Spanish as well too. So that was embarrassing, but anyway, there were very readily available, inexpensive classes because of this societal desire to recover from this period this most recent period of repression. And so I took advantage of them. I remember after a couple of years, in the beginning, I started at the very lowest level because whereas many people from Madrid, they can sort of understand Catalan without really, for me, it was quite opaque. I started at the bottom level, and so with a lot of Latin Americans. At that time, there were a lot of young people who had moved to Barcelona for various reasons from around Europe and Latin America. And then after a few years of studying, I realized the other people around me were all Catalans, many of them retired people who were taking advantage of a chance to learn to read and write in their native language. That was a very poignant moment for me. I'm a New Yorker, so I know a lot about language loss. I grew up around a lot of people, and myself, my grandfather was a German speaker. My grandmother, even though she was born in New York, spoke German, Yiddish, Hebrew. And I, of course, just spoke English because it gets lost very quickly. So I became also fascinated with the way Catalan has managed to survive. So that was an inspiration for me to continue to study it, and but also I was living in Barcelona at the time. So and in the States, my interest in Spanish had partly come out of a similar thing. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of Spanish speakers, and noticed that there were things that were beyond my reach that I wanted to access. And then my life took divergent paths from my original study. In college, I actually did an MFA in photography. I was a photographer for many years. So it was when I moved to Barcelona that I started to be offered the possibility to work as a translator, not as a literary translator initially, but just on a more pragmatic level. But because of my milieu, I started working on things like catalogs of books for literary fairs and things like that. So it was sort of literary ephemera, because luckily for me, English is the lingua franca of the publishing world in Europe, certainly, and in many ways around the world. So people who were looking to increase the scope of local literature needed to have all their materials in English. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the ways that I got started, and kind of built my way up from there.
So did you start doing things like sample translations and kind of translation for kind of publishers and things like that to advertise books? Was it that kind of?
Spoiler alert, I still do a lot of sample translations. And it's you have to work a lot to piece together a living in this.
You want to just in case
a couple of translations a year.
Just in case the students don't know, could you want to just talk through what a sample translation is and what kind of the translations that you do for a publisher based in Barcelona, for example, who are kind of looking to sell the translation rights?
Usually it's the first 1 to 3 chapters, or between 20 and 50 pages at the beginning of a book. it will be other things, like part the beginning and part of the middle, but usually it's the beginning of a book and a synopsis, and a biography of the author, you know, a little bio, that's used to pique interest for scouts and editors around the world. So it's just you know, a brief look at what the book could be in English.
So obviously you come very far from those days where you kind of were feeling your way through by just kind of starting off doing sample translations to the point that you're at now. How has the way that you approach your work changed, or how has, I mean, kind of looking back at the first book that you translated compared to what you're translating now, how do you think you've kind of evolved as a translator? Has your approach to it changed?
There's a lot of things. One of the most important, and I feel it's partly come about because of my relationship with Catalan language, is that I work much more closely with the authors now, and that for me has become a very special part of the experience. In fact, with learning to talk to plants, Marta and I did a residency together in upstate New York for 2 weeks. That was amazing. You know, I had already had a pretty finished draft of the translation, but I was able to really, you know, go over every little thing with her that I wasn't sure about. And so she read it and commented on it. I'm also lucky that, you know, a fair number of authors have a familiarity with English. So I recently have been working on a book with Irene Solà. That's a very beautiful book, and she had actually done her master's degree in London. So, you know, when she tells me she loves the translation, it means a lot to me. So that's been the most special change, I would say, over the course of the last nearly 20 years.
A great one. But luckily that you're translating contemporary authors, though, I guess.
Yes, I rarely get the chance to translate dead authors, but there's some that I sometimes I get asked to contribute a little something to a magazine, and then sometimes I'll take the chance to work with an author that I otherwise I don't think, you know, many editors would think of me. I mean, they're also just authors that editors aren't thinking about, you know, like Perucho or Pera Caldes, because there's no agents that are really pushing them. And so it's the contemporary authors that have more of a chance to find an audience in English, because it's such a small portion of the UK and US markets that are devoted to translation at all.
Absolutely.
So it's a difficult process for a book to make its way onto the bookshelves. There's a lot more work in agents and foreign rights people trying to sell these books. So then there is in them actually finding a home.
So how do you come across your work now? How does the work come to you? Are you approached by publishers and editors? Do you pitch, or is it a mixture of both?
Historically, I have mostly reacted to offers that I get, and I'm starting now to do more pitching, but a lot of times it's a lot of work for the payoff that one is asked to put in. But I also have a lot of relationships with editors and with agents who you know, they'll say, will you do a sample? And they pay me for the sample, but then, you know, they kind of want to attach my name to it, and not that the project could go to someone else if it were ever bought, but there's more kind of without me actually saying I'm gonna, you know, go make the effort to write up a whole bio and synopsis and, you know, send it out to different editors. Some translators do. I don't know as much about the literary translation scene in the UK as I do in the States. And from what I do know, it seems that there are more people trying to make a living as freelance literary translators. In the States, it's almost unheard of. Most translators are also professors. So their approach it is a different than mine, because they're able to go about things in a different way. Whereas I need to keep working on projects that pay. So.
Yeah, I think in the UK over the last kind of 10 years, there's been a lot of kind of small independent publishers that have sprang up that are willing to take risks on kind of less commercial, less mainstream books. I think that's made a difference. Interestingly, I think often kind of when you come through the kind of more traditional route of translation, and, you know, you're doing an MA in translation, and you start to kind of analyze translations and look at quite often, you know, you kind of attribute the translation to the translator, kind of forgetting all of the other agents that are involved, that, you know, your editors, your copy editors and so on. Could you talk a little bit about the collaborative process that it is to actually put a translation together, and you know, kind of your work with editors and how
Sure.
relationships are?
Do you mean in the acquisition process or
the
in
actual translation process?
Well, it's interesting. I was doing an event recently virtually at the University of Chicago with Eugenia Brogi, who is the editor and publisher of L'Altra, which is a small independent press here in Catalonia, and the only books of hers that have gone into English I've translated, and so we have an interesting relationship in that way. And actually, the first book that she published, I translated, and that was Toni Sala's Als Nois. In English, it's called The Boys. And that was the first book. She reminded me that I now have a second that had never been translated into Spanish. So that was a very different experience, because usually a Catalan book has to go through that filter to get further in the global landscape. And so, but with Toni Sala's book, now this is about acquisition, but I had translated a story of his before, and it had been published in a small periodical in the States. And then Eugenia asked me to translate a sample of that book, and it was read by the editor who decided to buy it. And then he contacted me to translate the full book. And well, the process after you've signed the contract and you've gotten all the terms negotiated, once you deliver the translation, it's read by usually an editor, a line editor, and a copy editor. In the States, the copy editors are I sometimes have to translate for the author, because they sometimes approach fiction as if they're fact checking it. You know, they're saying, well, this actually happened, and you know, it's like, it's fiction, but they worry a lot about the timelines and stuff like that authors, things that I don't find authors are usually very worried about. So they have all kinds of suggestions that they'll send back to me. sometimes they find mistakes, and sometimes they just question a word choice or a lot of different things. And then I usually have a pretty quick turnaround to get those proofs back to them. There's a couple of different, once the book is set in type, they don't want you to make a lot of changes. So there's a period in there where you can change whatever you want, but as it gets further into the process. But often you'll turn in a translation, you're working on another translation, and it's sitting, or I don't know, it's with the editor, I don't know where, and then you get it back and you're expected to turn it around in 2 weeks, so that can be a little harried. So,
have you ever had difficult conversations where they want you to make changes that you've not wanted to make, or they?
I always feel confident in STET. We have STET for a reason, and I really appreciate this. I was saying what Eugenia said is that how she edits translations, and she was saying she's really hands-on, and she thought I was going to be upset about that, and she would get some blowback from me. But I said no. The worst thing is you get proofs back and there's like no changes. You're like, no, I'm not perfect. Like, I want feedback. I thrive on that, and it's just the same as my exchanges with the authors, which a lot of times are through email, and it's a way for me to get to know their voice as well. But sometimes I find mistakes, I find things I say, this is a little weird, or this doesn't really work, and that is valuable for them if they're of a mind to appreciate it, which many are. And I feel the same way about being edited on the other end. And of course, it's a different book. And each house will have its own style of, if you translate street names, or how you do little things like that. So, and of course, I work with British publishers and American publishers, and I'm hopelessly American, as you can tell. So I try to put in the trousers and stuff, but the punctuation is also different. So, and the prepositions, that's something I can't fake.
It's so interesting.
Yes.
There's so many nuances, isn't there, within the one language. And so we talked a little bit about kind of what the job entails in terms of sample translations, but is there anything else that you do apart from kind of actually translating? What else do you do, kind of events and that kind of thing? Is that what you'd count as now part of your job, kind of?
Yes, it's interesting because I'm somewhat in the translation community here in Spain, and it's much more, they take much more of a back seat. Whereas increasingly, I feel English language translators are asked to promote their books. I mean, some of them even tour rather extensively, like my friend Peter Bush. And I enjoy traveling and talking about my work, so there's been opportunities for me to do that. And I do interviews. In fact, with Alicia, whose name is not really Alicia, that's a pseudonym. I did an interview with her that was super interesting for Bomb magazine. I don't know if you could access it, but where we talked to, and Bomb is sort of like interview magazine where it's a conversation more than and actually I could send it to you if you want it.
That'd be great.
So but most of that is not money earning activity. You know, sometimes I'll get invited places, but you know, usually that's just sort of kind of service to the community and to your work. And I serve on prize juries. I'm on a jury right now where I have a lot of reading to catch up on for a new prize. It's called the Premi Finestras. And that's just for best novel in Catalan. And there's also a nonfiction production prize in Catalan. But I've served on prize juries for translations as well. I write a catalog every year called the New Catalan Fiction Catalog for the Institut Ramon Llull, which is, I don't know how familiar your students are, but that it's a government agency of the Catalan regional government that is entirely devoted to promoting Catalan culture abroad, not only literature, but of course I work with the literature branch, and they fund translations. They even fund translation samples. Sometimes they'll hire me directly to do a sample for an author that they're hoping to promote. So they go to fairs and work much like the agents do, but in a more disinterested way, just at the service of Catalan culture. And so each year, and this started out, I used to translate the catalog for them, and then they decided that I should just write it instead. And so I started doing that in 2012. And so each year they choose the 10 novels that they want to promote, and I read them and write a catalog to present them to the world, to the world's editors. What else? I sometimes translate film scripts. I also do some children's books. And sometimes I'll do an entire translation in children's books. It's quite common, but even sometimes for novels, I'll do it without a publisher, and an agent or foreign rights person at a publishing house will invest, and I don't know exactly how. I think sometimes the authors themselves. Sometimes I work directly for an author. They'll ask me to. They'll hire me to translate a book for them, and then they can self-publish it or shop it around. What else do I do?
I've got a question. What film scripts have you translated?
I don't think it's anything that you would have heard of. I recently did a film called Un crit sota l'aigua, which a lot of times they need a translation into English in the production stage. Okay. Because they're co-productions, and they are looking for producers. So, they need to have it in English because all the producers can read in English. And then sometimes it'll be adapted to subtitles. If you do subtitles, it's a whole nother can of worms because it has to fit on the screen. And it's a sort of interesting thing. I used to do a series of the compilations of comic strips. So that was a fun job for a while. You get paid by the word. It's not very profitable, but
there's not many words in comics.
But I enjoy wordplay, and I enjoy working with visual things. That's one of the things that's interesting about Brother and I is her visual background, her visual arts background, and how that appears throughout the book. So what else? But yeah, I do a lot of samples for publishers, for across the board.
I guess what that's really good though. I mean, it kind of gives you. I mean, that's one of the benefits of also being based in Barcelona, isn't it? Is that to be a literary translator based in the country that you're translating, of the language that you're translating, or the state of the language that you're translating, is a kind of, you're immersed in, you know what's coming out, you know who the new and upcoming writers are, and which is very different, isn't it, than trying to do it from a distance, I guess. Can I talk a little bit, bring it back a little bit to Catalan translation, and kind of translating Catalan more generally. We've got another question as well on the chat, and maybe that's interesting. You do translation both from Spanish and Catalan, is that right? Do you still translate from Spanish? Do you still do some Spanish translation?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I had one of my favorite authors who, unfortunately, his book came out in this pandemic year of hell and got very little attention, who is Patricio Pron. He's an Argentine author who lives in Madrid. And his book is set in Italy, just to make it more confusing for Anglo-centric minds. And that book came out in the States with Knopf this year. And I translated a book by Javier Calvo that's coming out in early next year. And yeah, one of the things, I mean, people think of me a lot for Catalan, so I get offered a lot of contemporary Catalan authors. And in the States, I think there's more of an interest in Latin American authors than in peninsular Spanish authors. And although I actually can do that, and when I first moved here, everyone was like, "Why do you talk like a Mexican?" Like, so I have a whole history there, but people don't think, the editors don't think of me first in their mind for Latin American authors, I don't think. So I get offered there's less competition too.
Yeah.
For Catalan, definitely.
And do you think, I mean, there hasn't there a change in the kind of the amount of translation of Catalan literature that's being published in the kind of the last 20 years? How do you see that? How do you see the changes and why the changes have come about?
Well, I think there's been two concurrent evolutions in Anglophone literature. There's more little independent presses that are just doing translations, and there's a growing interest in translation. There's been some successful things that, we hadn't seen probably since the Latin American boom, where people thought, oh, maybe this is a viable, a financially viable choice to publish translations. And in terms of Catalan, the Institut Ramon Llull, which is existed, I guess, for 11, maybe 12 years now, I've lost count. Their funding, it makes a difference. I saw Deborah Smith, she's a British translator, speak one time at a conference, and she told me that she decided to study Korean and she wanted to be a translator. She decided to study Korean because it's very well funded. And I thought, wow, I couldn't imagine thinking about it that way, but it was smart. It worked very well. And so there are certain languages, certain countries that have put money into it, and Catalunya is one of them now. Also, Catalunya's gotten a little more known on the international map because of political events, but also because of this investment that the Yule has done in promoting Catalan literature. But to me, that's inherent in, what's interesting about Catalan literature is that it's I mean, what language has been revived in this way? Hebrew maybe, but it's pretty amazing, the trajectory of Catalan language throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st. And we have a few great translators too. Peter Bush has really done a lot of the modern classics that have given context to the work that I do. There, we also are blessed to have a very rich literature. So once people started looking for it, and they, there was funding makes it.
Funding, that's okay. Brilliant, thank you. So should we bring it to the kind of the two books that I also happen to have here? Could you tell us a little bit, if we start with Brother in Eyes, which I think it's just such an amazing book in so many ways, and kind of one of the reasons, and kind of what we'll come on to when we do the discussion as a group, is kind of what we were talking about being having a sample translation and giving that as a token of what the book is about and everything. And I find that really interesting for this book particularly, isn't it? A really interesting case is how you kind of sum it up with an opening chapter as a sample translation. But could you tell us a little bit about how this translation came into being, a little bit about the book generally maybe, and maybe a little bit about the author as well?
Well, I actually remember I was in Santiago de Chile. I got invited to Chile. It was amazing. I was at the book fair, and I was with an editor who's Venezuelan but lives in Barcelona. And she was saying, oh, they bought Germana Gel, you should translate it. I'm going to write, and so, and it came to be, I was asked to do a sample for the publisher, and he requested samples from 3 other translators, I guess. This has become a pretty common practice, which I think as an editor, it's probably a great way to to choose a translator. Of course, we're kind of a small club, so it's a little weird too. And it's usually very short, but you're usually not paid for it. So that's sort of problematic too for me as someone who really strives to defend the professionalization of literary translation. But it is, and sometimes I will say, okay, I'll do it, but you have to pay me for it. And sometimes, depending on my circumstances, I'll just, and if it's quite short, usually, just take the chance, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But in this case it did. And so if you are chosen for a project that way, it is a kind of a nice way to start a relationship with an editor. Yeah. One of the things that I wish weren't the case about my profession as compared to, say, a translator in Spain, is that I rarely work with the same editors. I mean, even when I do, there's usually 5 years in between, and there isn't the same It partly just has to do with volume of translations that are made. But there also isn't usually a lot of, what's the word? A lot of commitment to authors. Sometimes they'll do one book and maybe they didn't even promote it that well, but then it didn't sell well, but then they just drop them, or they move to a different house, or so that's frustrating for me, because it undermines, I think, what you're able to do. Between you're having to scrape things together, and but that's just the reality of it.
Tell us a little bit about translating Brother in Ice, because it's a book that when you read, I mean, it's beautifully translated and the prose is amazing, but you kind of read it and from a translation perspective, when you see all the voices and all the genres and all the different snippets of everything in there, I mean, to make that distinction between all of those different voices that run through it must have been a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think the book draws you in a way. I mean, a translator is just a kind of specialized reader, but I think that the book has a way of drawing you in as a reader, where you're looking at all these sort of seemingly disparate pieces, but they're hanging together through this overarching metaphor of the Arctic explorations, and it's young woman's coming of age as an artist, and any translation, you kind of start at the beginning and work your way through.
I was really interested when you said that you did photography as well, because of that being so key to the book as well. I mean, I keep wanting to call it a novel, but I'm not sure what it is either, which I think is interesting. But how did your experiences of photography also kind of influence your translation, or did it, or was it just kind of there in the background?
Well, I mean, there's certain things that I think of as sort of quasi literary practices. Photography is one, or thinking about photography, and baseball is another. It has this narrative structure to it that it feeds into it. But that's a question that I've thought about. I recently did a translation that's coming out early next year, which was a very, very crazy project. It's like this, it's mostly written in this fake 17th century Catalan. So I had to invent an English for that, and it draws on all these things. And there happened to be things like that I had experience with. I mean, first of all, Spanglish. I also used to work in a Chicano theater in one of my previous lives. And I also, one of my earliest jobs was I worked for a 16th century historian. And so I would deal with these documents because, part of this book is like a trial, and those kind of legal battles that were going on during the conquest, discovery, whatever you want to call it. And so it tapped into things that I sort of felt like, oh God, I'm kind of uniquely have a reason to be doing this. And then there's other times when it's, you think, am I the right person for this job? Is there, does a translator need to be matched via their points of reference, or, I mean, it's an interesting question. And given the amount of books that are translated into English, I think it'd be very hard to find out, because I mean, you're always doing research, even if something is very close to your experience, just the way writers are always doing research. So, in learning to talk to plants, the protagonist is a doctor. So that, you know,
you've not had any experience in that though.
in this book, actually, there were a lot of moments where I felt very identified. So, you know, emotionally, there's a relationship that Paula, the protagonist, has with her older father, and her mother had died when she was young, and it was like, you know, I was all in there emotionally, which, you know, is just luck, really. But, you know, the research is fun too, you know, and I love. There's a Peruvian novelist that I work with sometimes, and, you know, it's requires a lot of, you know, just on a linguistic level, but also historical, cultural. There's a lot of things in play, but that's our job.
Yeah, and I think the kind of that I was saying before, wasn't it? The kind of they seem so different at one point, but actually, that I think there's so much in it. And I think almost one of the things that is in both of them is what's not said, is kind of the silences that run through, that you kind of you being told certain things, which I think is really interesting and really interesting to play with. And I think the visual culture in Brother and I's particularly, you have to paint that picture, I think so. And I think that comes, you are painting a picture with the words, and it's really interesting, two levels. Can we move on to learning to talk about plants a little bit? Helena's just put in the chat about how much there is I mean, I think the research is quite obvious in this book that you would have to do, because it's very clearly set out, as in that this talks about this. But this one, there is obviously a lot of research that needed to have gone there, but that's kind of it just fits in very neatly into the story. But I imagine that the kind of technical kind of pediatrics that were kind of forming the background to it, I imagine there was quite a lot of research with that for the translation as well.
Yeah, as I say, I had a very special experience with this book, because I was able, there's different moments in the translation, and I mark things that I want to come back to for whatever reason with an asterisk, and then usually I will talk to somebody who's a native speaker. If it's a grammatical question, or sometimes the question is just, is this like sound odd, or is this sound normal? Because a lot of times I can judge that, because I've been living in Catalonia for many years, but not always. So you don't want to flatten out something that the author has done that's different. That sounds different. But there's also a point where when I'm going through the asterisks, and sometimes usually if I can, I'll email the author and I'll ask them a question. Sometimes they send me photos, going back to this visual thing, especially if there's boats. For some reason, I have like a block against boats. To send me a picture of this boat first of all, because I need to see what it is. But or sometimes if it's like animal, like little bugs and stuff, that can be very regional. So you want to make sure you're getting that right. So you ask sometimes they're very technical questions, where you think, is this an error? I'm not sure. You never want to assume that it's an error and fix it, because things like that. But then there's also a point where you have to say, as RuPaul would say, step your pussy up and, make the decisions. You have the confidence I
Yeah.
often say that in translation, you want to have a lot of humility, but you also need to have confidence.
Right.
And so there's a point where I say, okay, come on, you know what this is. So, and you do it because you can't ask them everything that you might wonder about. But in the case of this book, I went to the friggin' woods with the author for 2 weeks, and I was able to ask her everything. I saved an earlier version, and I had the notes from the editor too. So there were those, which I often will send me running back to the author to I don't like to speak for the author. And sometimes the questions are really for the author, not for me. So I play the intermediary there. But so that was a really interesting learning experience for me, because you realize the assumptions that you make and that you have to make in your interpretation. Also, one of the fun moments for me is when I ask an author a question and they say, I don't know. It just came out that way. And as the historian I used to work for always said, negative results are still results. And it's, if they don't know, then that opens up a space for you, which, I don't translate poetry, but sometimes I try. And you need to inhabit that space of not knowing, which is hard.
Which I guess is the space of the reader as well, though, isn't it? The reader doesn't, the reader of whichever text it might be, whether it be the original or the translation, they don't know everything, do they? That's not, I don't know.
Yeah, but that the author doesn't know everything either. No. Because you do, sometimes I try to remember not to have too much certainty about my reading of something. Confidence, but not too much confidence.
Was that the first time that you'd done a residency with an author, the one that you did with Marta?
Yeah, it's a very
rare
opportunity.
How was the experience?
Well, it was interesting because I wanted to apply for it because I had been aware of it. I know that Christina McSweeney had done it a few years earlier, and I had seen her at an event speaking about the experience. And I love artist residencies, and this one is amazing. It's in a sculpture park. It's just beautiful, and it's a lovely way to spend a few weeks, to being pampered a little bit. But so I wanted to apply, and I thought, well, I needed a project that would be at the right point. You can't go before you've started the book, because it's all questions. The questions come at a certain point, because also some of the questions solve themselves as you work through the book. Or you solve them as you work through the book, but they become clearer. So it had to be a book that, and actually the publication of this book ended up being pushed back because of this residency, which wasn't my intention at the time. But so I also had to think, what author would I want to spend 2 weeks in the woods with? I love my authors, but not all of them. And I didn't know Marta before we went. But I just had a feeling that, on the chance that they accepted us, because it's quite competitive. And I wrote to her and I suggested it. And she was excited about it. So I said, well, let's give it a try and see. And we only met once before that. She also lives in Barcelona, which is sort of funny, because we went to this space in New York State. But we met up for coffee beforehand, after we had already, committed to going. But so we didn't know each other, but it was very special. We were 4 pairs of translators, Korean translator and her author. We're all women too. It's great. Bulgarian translator and author, Icelandic translator and author, and us, Catalans. So it was really special. And actually, we now have in Olot, you're probably aware of this, we have a residency program, and it's called FABER, and it looks like it's going to be expanded in other parts of the Catalan territory, but I've been trying to open up a space there for more translators to be able to work with their authors. And I did a residency there this fall, and I invited Irene Solá, who's a wonderful
I just
author.
ask, what book are you translating of hers?
Canto yo y la montaña vaya.
So
It's not coming out for a while, but it's such a beautiful book.
It's a really beautiful book.
Well, I'm hoping to do. I love Els Dics too. Els Dics is more like Germà de Gel, and you know she's shockingly young. I mean, she's such a beautiful writer. Anyway, we also have a lovely relationship now, and she's writing a new book as well. So hopefully I'll be working more with her in the future. But I invited her to come, and that was also, you know, she had a chance to read the whole translation, and we just had our mind meld. But so I'm hoping to create more of a space for that here in Catalunya, because I think it's really a special possibility. I'm not really reading the chat. Are you translating?
Yeah, no, I can't run my eye in it. You're fine. I can't wait to read your translation of that novel, because it was just beautiful. Just beautiful. I forgot what I was going to say now. Oh yeah. So I think we'll open it out to discussion in just a little minute. But what brings it out nicely is kind of the idea that when you're that we were talking about the reader and the reader not knowing, the kind of the space of the reader is not knowing everything, isn't it? Kind of translation theory, which you know that's what we have to cover and we have to learn, talks about the reader a lot and about the importance of translating for a reader, and the reader kind of dictating kind of translation decisions or translation approaches to some degree. Do you think about the reader when you translate? Do you have a reader in mind? Are you aware of your reader?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm in a sort of liminal space, because I kind of have my Catalan life and my American life, and I realize it like when friends come from America to visit me, and I try to get my friends together in a bar, and I realize it's not working, because usually it's, in large part just language problems. But so there's, and within my family, which is like a multilingual, my immediate family space, there's times when I can speak 3 languages in the same sentence and everyone will understand me, or my kids will correct me. But there's certain concepts that I would rarely try to say in English, because they don't exist in that part of my world. So I guess what I'm mostly aware of is, and in this book by Max Besorra, which I referenced, that which is called in English and coming out very soon in the States, called The Adventures and Misadventures of something, Joan Orpí. Let's just call it Joan Orpí. It's I don't know if you are familiar with this book, but it won the Ciutat de Barcelona prize a few years ago, and it hasn't been translated into Spanish. But it's a very interesting book. But so in that way, I do think about particularly an American reader as having some knowledge of Spanish in a way that I can exploit, dinero, fiesta, kind of thing. That and actually, in the Irene Solá, I thought about that too, because there's one chapter that's entirely in Spanish in that book, actually, and that's a reality in Catalan that's very hard to transmit. And so I rely a little bit on the American readers' coexistence with Spanish language to sometimes create it's a not a great approximation, but it's the best I've found to approximate that the ways that, particularly in Barcelona, Spanish and Catalan coexist, where there can be a conversation where one person's speaking Spanish, the other person's answering them in Catalan, or a million varying degrees of that is a richness to, as much as some people hate that bastardization, it's a richness to our language that's hard to convey in English. So I think about it a little bit differently when I'm thinking more of a British reader than an American reader, if that answers your question.
It does. And that's really interesting. Actually, that's really interesting, because I think I've heard a lot of translators speak where they kind of downplay the differences between British English and American English and the different versions. So it's quite interesting to hear a useful distinction between them that can be used to an advantage. Actually, I think that's a really interesting perspective. Quite often it's how to neutralize it so those distinctions don't exist. But I think that's a and I think maybe for a British English reader that's not necessarily a problem either, because I think we're exposed to the differences as well. So I don't think that would necessarily be a problem either. But
I recently read an interview with Jeff Dyer, who is a British author, of course, but who lives in California, and is quite well published in the States now too. And he says that he insists on maintaining the British punctuation, because otherwise it doesn't look like he wrote it. What is really interesting, like put that comma outside of the quotation marks or inside, or and those things. I mean, British English is so rich. British is not the right word for it, but the languages of the UK and Ireland, and I've traveled a bit, but sometimes it's like, there are times when it's hard to communicate, and all I get is what wolf. I think, oh man. Of course, I'm a New Yorker, and when I'm in California, I feel those differences. Forget Texas, or it's I would love to come to Cork. I saw that. I love Ireland. Well, which reminds me, if you haven't read it, which you probably have, Peter Bush wrote a article. I don't know where it was originally published, but I could get it to you if you need it. That's about the three different translations of La Plaza del Diamant, which is the only, and the first one was Irish, and so that was one of the interesting things that the and that woman is still living, I think. we should get her on a stage with Peter. I mean, David Rosenthal, of course, is no longer with us, but it would be quite interesting.
That's a really interesting example, actually. There's kind of, there's time differences as well, isn't there? So there's time differences as well as language differences and everything in there, which is nicely kind of almost spaced out, over the course of, was it 40 years, maybe 30 years, 40 years of each translation being published, which is, Helena says she's an emeritus professor, 50 years, thank you, an emeritus professor of Trinity College. So there you go, she's...
Yeah. Well, it couldn't have been 50 years between each of them. I mean,
no, but 50 across the 50 year span of the three translations.
Yeah. Well, that to me is an interesting idea. I'm actually one of the things on my plate now is to do a sample of Camila Sirga by Jesus Moncada.
Mm-hmm.
And
was it? That was translated, wasn't it? Has that been translated?
Yeah. I said when they offered me the job, I said, well, and they said, well, it's kind of old. And I thought, okay. I mean, it's a great book. I'm interested in this challenge, and I'm not going to dispute the idea of translations aging. Aging out.
But I think but
it's a weird idea to me.
But also with Catalan, because there's so much more resources in terms of language, like in terms of dictionaries and things like that. I think that, and I don't know. I think that might affect it as well. As kind of, because I think there was an issue with accuracy of some of the points as well, wasn't there? Of the translation, the first translation of, I don't know.
I don't know. I'm not looking at it until I do mine, but we'll see. We'll see what comes of it. But it's an interesting question. That is kind of a through line between some of the issues we've been raising. Is there a right translator for a job? British versus American. British is UK. Trying to be inclusive. And this idea of a time frame, I mean, because if we're, or how a translation ages, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
I don't have the answers.
No, so there probably is then. There's just opinions, I guess. I'm going to open it out to see if anybody wants to kind of talk about their. If anyone wants to put their camera on, if you'd like to put your camera on, then we can have kind of a little bit of the discussion as well. It'd be nice. And if anybody has any comments that they'd like to make about the chapters that they read, about their kind of, I mean, again, there's no right or wrong answers to their comments, to your comments about the chapters. But kind of first impressions, of as I said, think was particularly interesting about the first chapter of A Brother in Ice is the idea that to use a sample translation as kind of a way of selling a book with Brother in Ice, I think is a particularly interesting one, because it doesn't tell you a lot about the book. So I think it's interesting to think about how a publisher would have decided to, I know that there were reviews and things like that as well, but I think, it's really interesting as to why they might have decided to take on or to publish that translation from that first chapter. So if anybody's got any comments or any questions that they'd like to make, then please do. Helena.
Well, I should say, in the case of Germada Gel, I think the editor was able to read the Spanish version, which actually it was translated by the author. So slightly different, which is another very interesting thing about contemporary Catalan literature, and especially with these young people, they're translating themselves.
Yeah.
So you're entering into a conversation, and you can look at what they've done, and then you're like, wait, you changed. They have a freedom to, create versions.
I think under the stories as well, the publisher also has a particular type of book that they go for, don't they? They've got a very strong ethic as a publishing house as well, don't they?
Yeah.
So,
I wanted to mention, you're probably aware of this, but maybe not all your students are. There's a new publishing house that's kind of between, it's based in London, but between Catalonia and London, that's called Funda Stampa. That's only doing literature, including poetry, from Catalan into English. So this is a unheard of opportunity for people that are translating from Catalan. Pretty interesting.
It's a really interesting initiative. And he's going for the classics, isn't he, largely as well?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think there's some things that that people were working on as like a labor of love that he's created a possible home for, like Ronald Pupo's Maragall, which, you know, obviously wasn't like, hey, you want to translate Maragall? You know, it was like he. So, but I think it's going to be quite eclectic within those kind of tight parameters, rather eclectic collection from what I've seen of what they're planning. So, because there's some, you know, contemporary authors as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. So
I was going to ask you about what you just said about the Alicia Kopf book, that she self-translated into Spanish. And did you translated from Catalan, but did you bear in mind some of the solutions in the Spanish, some of the change?
Yeah, I looked at it. I translated from the Catalan, but then if I wasn't sure about something, I would look at what she had done, and I still had questions for her. we it corresponded quite a bit, because it's a very personal story for her. Yeah.
So where were the differences? What had she rewritten? Was it around idioms and things like that? Was she using different references?
I'm not sure. I mean, it wasn't the quotes by any means, but I can't say that I really remember examples, or even that book had many cases of it. But I've been in that situation with a number of authors recently. I mean, there's also of course worked with authors who've been translated into Spanish by other people. Which is really my only other language that I have access to. I mean, Jordi Nopka, who is also another author who is coming out in the States in January. Do you know Jordi's work?
Yeah.
And he self-translates. I would say more freely than Alicia Kopf does. And Max Besora also has a book now that he has self-translated, which I
find it really fascinating, because I don't know, we have a colleague up in Galway who translates Manolo Rivas's poetry, who also self-translates himself into Spanish, but the poetry changes each time. So there's that question of which one's the version that you're translating comes into play.
Yeah.
Do you? Yeah.
I would like to stick with the original, which is sometimes elusive in this case, because we have such a extreme bilingualism here.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's very hard to, but you know, someone who's young and writing a novel in Catalan, you know, that's something that I respect, you know, that decision. It's not one to be taken lightly, you know. That's your language of expression. So, but with Alicia, she's very bilingual, and you know, it's an interesting question, especially with the self-translation. But even, you know, sometimes I will look at another translation. In one case, there was a very strangely bad translation into Spanish. I mean, you'd think it's not possible. It was actually translated by an Argentinian. I don't know why. When Catalonia is full of bilingual people, someone would hire an Argentinian to translate a novel from Catalan into Spanish, not for the Argentine market, but for it to be published here. And so that was very strange. But usually it's interesting to see what other people do. I mean, I also find, I mean, if there's changes, I stick with the Catalan version, unless, you know, there's some reason why I wouldn't. But they're usually, the problems that I'm looking to solve don't exist in the same way between a translation from Catalan to Spanish, because they're both Romance languages. Their cultural references are very similar. So usually the problem that I'm having, it's not solved by referring to the Spanish translation. But as a point of reference, it becomes much more interesting when it's a self-translation. But usually my problems are other ones. So.
I'm hoping that the others will ask some questions as well, but I do have a particular question that I wanted to ask you in relation to your translation of Germà de Gel, because I read that book maybe a few years ago in Catalan. So I hadn't read your translation until I read the section that Jennifer gave to us, and I'd completely forgotten about that Matrushka section at the beginning. So what my memory of the book is very much the parallel between the landscape and the brother. Whereas I kind of, when I was reading that section, I just thought, oh, that is such a gift to a translator who's finding their way through to the voice of this author. Was it like that when you were translating? Did you feel like that when you were translating that book?
I definitely related to the protagonist's story of coming of age, and her relationship with her family, in a more direct way, I would say, than with, you know, some of the kind of research pieces. They're colder, pun intended, I guess. And the brother to me was a means to an end, really, to talk about her. You know, it's her really who is finding her way as an artist, kind of rebelling against her family dynamics. And I know that for her, the brother is such an important part of it, but I was more focused on her, more on her than anything else. That was what engaged me. It's sort of interesting as I get older, I think, you know, some of these authors could be my kids. And so, you know, impressed, like with Irene Solá, it's just like the freedom and the, you know, the wherewithal that they bring to their writing. It's really special to be able to inhabit it. And yeah, what Alicia did here, it's, you know, it's very brave.
Does anybody have any other questions? I'm very aware of that.
Do. Hi. Sorry, just going
Hi,
to jump on in.
please do.
Also a fellow American. Hello, Mara. And sorry, I would turn on my camera, but for some reason with Zoom, it's not working. Let me try again. It looks like my name just disappeared, so I know it's not very pleasant to not see my face, but anyways, so I just wanted to say, yeah, I really enjoyed the bits that Jennifer sent us. They were great. I was surprised. I don't know why I was surprised. I guess that's a weird word to say, but what I'm saying is that I really enjoyed them and got hooked instantly. I felt they were both kind of unexpectedly kind of dark, which I always liked. I don't know if that was just my interpretation of it or what stuck out to me. But I guess my question is just more of a general lighter question. As somebody who sort of just started as a translator and have more so been focusing on more just kind of like not literary translation. Even with that, the other day I was working on a text, I think it was 3 measly paragraphs, and I found myself really diving in. I was printing it, marking it all up, like reading it out loud to myself. There was such a process of sort of like textual understanding going on, and it was 3 paragraphs. And it was, you know, there wasn't really too much there to really get into. So I was just wondering for you, if you, you know, you get assigned a project or somebody signs you on, or, you know, the process goes and you find yourself just about to translate a book. Is there any, so obviously you read the book, but are there any kind of interesting tricks that you have or methods that you have to really kind of get into the book and get a deeper understanding? I don't know, like mark it all up with different colors or listen to an ebook and then reread it, or are there things like that? Like, how do you go about sort of getting that deeper level of textual understanding that I think is so sometimes hard to get to in order to then translate it? It's kind of a long-winded question, but yeah, just any funny things that you might do to kind of get a deeper analysis.
I actually find sometimes I'll read a book and then I'll be asked to translate it, and when I start to translate it, I almost feel as if I'm starting from zero, because the process of trying to turn it into English is so different than just reading it, to read the story or, you know, enjoy the prose. That for me, I really feel like the first step is just kind of rolling up my sleeves and getting in there. And usually when I'm editing and revising, I have to fix the beginning the most, because I'm just getting in there. But that there's no other way for me to really get in there than to just get in there. Some translators don't even read the books, you know, and they have the reading experience as they go. One trick that I got from Danny Hahn, Sir Danny Hahn, or Knight of the British something, it is to, when you're rereading your translation, to change the font so that it looks new to you.
Okay.
Which I sometimes remember to do. I like the idea of it, but yeah, some days it's harder going than others, and I just think I'm gonna get the one word to the next word, and if I have to look up every word. I use the dictionary a lot. I use a lot of online dictionaries, and then I use Catalan to Catalan dictionaries and Catalan to English dictionaries, and sometimes I go through Spanish because there's a lot more Spanish dictionaries. And I get into those forums, which don't trust them, but sometimes they're helpful. They're very random other times. But I just, as I say, if I sometimes I look up every word. It's not always that I don't know the word, but I don't know how, and it's just a way for me to get where I'm going. And then, you know, once the words are there on the page, then I look at them again. You have to find a balance between like kind of deconstructing the words in the text and then, you know, stepping back and getting a broader picture of the book. So a lot of it is very intuitive, and the more you practice, the easier it comes. But of course, you know, to be honest, you have a deadline and you have to sit in your chair and knock it out. And that helps. Otherwise, if I would just say, I'm going to go to the coffee shop and think about this word, I would have very few published translations.
Good, thank you. That makes sense, because yeah, sometimes I find myself thinking I just need to get started instead of sort of just rereading it and rereading, or you know, things like that. It makes a lot of sense to kind of do it and then, you know, learn or refine, or kind of it's a process that you gotta kind of start in order to do, if that makes sense. But yeah, thank you. Great.
Do you have any other questions?
Me, I don't. Not now. No.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay. Well, we've kind of run over an hour and a half. It's absolutely flown by. Mara, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could probably carry on asking you questions for about another 3 hours, but I shall let you go because we've taken up too much of your time already. But thank you so much, and like a massive virtual applause from everybody.
Thank you so much. Well, I hope we can do this in person.
That would be absolutely lovely.
And you know, do a workshop or something and see what your students are working on. And
yeah, that would be great. Absolutely.
Enjoy this time when you can futz around with text and not have to worry so much about deadlines. Although, of course, I'm sure your teacher gives you deadlines as well. But I took one class in translation in my undergraduate time, and I loved it because we were all working from different languages, and so the teacher had us do like a literal translation, and I just loved it. Every infinitive I would, you know, I made it super literal, and that was my favorite part. And then did the other version so he could understand what we were working with. But enjoy your time. I'd love
then we will
more about what you guys are working on.
Maybe we will pinch you to do a non-language specific workshop in the new year. Then.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
It would be wonderful for us. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody for attending. And we'll hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.